As traffic thunders around Big Ben, the House of Commons and Westminster Abbey, a scientist from King's College London is fitting small metal boxes to a group of MPs. Attached to each box is a plastic tube which runs to their lapel. For the next few days, it's going to suck the same air as the MPs themselves. Part of a new effort to fight one of Britain's greatest killers, air pollution.
So this is a black carbon monitor. It's a miniaturised version of the more complex instruments we use next to the street. And this is small enough to be carried. It's battery powered. It sucks air in through a tube onto a filter, and that continuously tells you how much black carbon there is in the air.
Okay, so if we look at the box here, it's about the size, and forgive me for the analogy, of a large cigarette packet. And it has a tube coming out of the top of it with a clip on the end. So how do I wear this?
So the clip's there so you can clip it close to where you're breathing, so on the lapel or by your mouth. And then you simply put this in your pocket. But importantly, we couple this with a GPS watch. The GPS watch tells us exactly where you are when you're breathing the pollution levels that the instrument's recording. And then we can relate what activities you're up to, where you are, geography, whether you're in a car, next to a street, or in your own home, to the pollution levels.
And what is this measuring?
Black carbon is a derivative of combustion. So we typically use it for looking at diesel emissions, because it's a good tracer for diesel emissions.
So how are you hoping to use this with the MPs? What are you hoping to learn?
Well, there's a number of different roles of these kind of monitors. The main thing is to try and show people pollution. They can relate these results so closely to their daily activities, it's almost like they can see the pollution. And this makes it much more engaging, so they can understand where pollution's coming from and how it affects their daily lives.
The MPs in Parliament Square, Joan Whalley, Mike Cain and Matthew Orford, are all members of the House of Commons Environmental Audit Committee. They want to know why dirty air is killing tens of thousands of British people every year and how to stop it. And those are the questions we'll aim to answer in today's Costing the Earth.
All the MPs are getting the monitoring kit on. Some seem to be favouring putting them in rucksacks rather than their pockets, but the idea is that the tube should be somewhere near their mouths. Just going to see how they feel about it. Seriously poorly. I'm impressed you've got it properly attached there. Some of the others are being a bit shy about these tubes. You've got it right up there, Matthew Orford. I'm impressed.
Yes.
It's not often you get to use MPs as scientific guinea pigs, which is sort of what you are today.
I think a lot of people would be happy to use MP as scientific guinea pigs. Air quality is a huge problem we know in London, and Oxford Street particularly. It'd be interesting to see how other colleagues' constituencies compare to that, but we believe that there's a real problem.
Your constituency is?
I'm in Hendon, so northwest London.
What do you think it'll be like there?
Well, I am quite worried. We have a lot of strategic roads, A1, A4, A6, A5, and I am worried that that will be fairly high in those localised areas.
Mike Cain, is that right?
That's Mike Cain, yes.
Where is your constituency?
It's Wythenshawe and Sale East in Manchester.
So how do you feel about being a bit of a lab rat for pollution, carrying your own stuff, monitoring gear with you?
Well, I think it's important to see. I mean, I'm very proud to come from a city that introduced the Clean Air Act in the 50s because we were a big industrial city. But I know, as I was saying in committee just the other week, that 9% of my neighbours die early because of pollution in the town. So I'm looking for that comparison of having a couple of days here in Westminster where I work during the week and then getting back to the constituency towards the end of the week and seeing what the differences are.
Joan, you're chair of this committee and your constituency is up in Stoke. Why is it that your committee is driving this issue about air pollution?
We just feel that there's a huge issue that is not being addressed. Tens of thousands of people are dying unnecessarily, and it is a public health issue, it's a transport issue, and it links in with every aspect of policy, and we are not meeting the environmental standards that we should.
Why do you think it hasn't caught on? Because it's for any of you, really. We're talking about 29,000 premature deaths a year, allegedly, and yet people don't seem to be concerned about it.
Well, I go back to 1955 thinking about what happened then with the Great Smog and with particular problems that we had, for example, in areas like Stoke-on-Trent, and that was not an invisible problem. When you had the smog, people could see it, they breathed it, and they were aware of what was happening, and it was fairly quick for an Act of Parliament from the City of London to go through and make that difference. What we're dealing with now is invisible, and it's therefore not high up in people's perceptions.
Should air pollution be treated as a national emergency in the same way as it was in the 1950s? Many health professionals and scientists like Benjamin Barrett from King's College London certainly think so.
Air pollution doesn't kill you in the same way as a road accident does. It's something which affects you throughout your life. So there's evidence that air pollution can cause low birth weight. There's evidence that air pollution can cause lungs in children to develop more slowly. So these things affect you for the whole of the rest of your life.
Public Health England recently published a report estimating the number of deaths attributable to air pollution in the UK, and this is equivalent to approximately 29,000 deaths.
Dr. Sotiris Vardulaikis is the air pollution expert for the Government Health Advisor's Public Health England.
People exposed to air pollution over the period of their life, they will have an increased risk to die from causes associated with respiratory and cardiovascular health. So air pollution is reducing their life expectancy. But all of us were exposed to some extent to air pollution, which has a harmful effect on health. This report that we published recently will contribute to raising the profile of air pollution and highlighting the problem associated with air pollution. It's not a trivial problem if we think that around 5% of total mortality in the UK is attributable to air pollution.
5% of total mortality in the UK put down to pollution. The reason for that extraordinary new figure is the discovery that bad air doesn't just affect our lungs, it's attacking our hearts as well. Dr. Jeremy Langrish of Edinburgh University is on the team investigating why that happens.
We've carried out a number of studies funded by the British Heart Foundation, investigating how exposure to these pollutants might affect the cardiovascular system and the mechanisms that might underlie this association that's seen in the epidemiological studies. And what we've shown is that exposure to diesel exhaust, and we've chosen diesel exhaust because within the urban environment, about 40% of the particulate pollution is due to diesel exhaust from passing traffic. So it's a very real model of ambient air pollution. We've shown that exposure to this diesel exhaust can affect the vascular system. It affects the way that blood vessels function, changes their ability to sort of respond to stress. It increases blood clotting, makes the blood stickier and more likely to clot, as well as changes in things like blood pressure. And all of these changes add up to partially explain why people may have heart attacks after exposure to pollution.
We're not just talking about long-term effects, although the evidence is there that living on a polluted street can bring on cardiac arrest and strokes. Breathing in filthy air now, Dr. Langrish says, can induce a heart attack.
All of these changes that I described happen very quickly indeed, and we can demonstrate them within some changes within the exposure itself and some changes within the few hours following that. Along with that, the epidemiological studies have suggested that short-term exposure to high levels of air pollution may in fact trigger myocardial infarctions, heart attacks, and that really fits with our research looking at the underlying mechanisms. There's a landmark study that was published by Annette Peters' group working in Germany, who looked at a group of people coming into hospital who have had a heart attack, and they found that the subjects were 3 times more likely to have been in traffic or exposed to high levels of traffic pollution immediately prior to the onset of their symptoms of the heart attack. More recently, it's been estimated that on a population level, acute exposure to traffic-derived air pollution may in fact be the most important trigger of myocardial infarctions over and above the more recognised triggers that we have. Now, the absolute risk is small, but because everybody is exposed, we have no choice whether to be exposed to air pollution or not. On a population level, that has a big effect.
This is Costing the Earth on BBC Radio 4, revealing the contaminated air of urban Britain that's harming our heart and lungs, consistently breaching the limits set by the EU and the World Health Organization. But why are things so bad? Regulations have cut back industrial emissions and our vehicles have got more efficient. Could it be that a popular technology, sold as environmentally friendly, is emerging as the enemy within? Ben Barrett at King's College London talked me through the recent history of air pollution.
10 or 15 years is particularly interesting because prior to that we made some really great progress, and there are some pollutants which have dropped by 80-90% over the last 20-25 years. Over the last 10 or 15 years, we're beginning to see a bit of a stagnation, and some of the improvements we were expecting from cleaner vehicles haven't really delivered. There are still improvements, and it is still slowly improving, but not as rapidly as we would have hoped.
Why are we not seeing that improvement?
Well, a lot of these improvements are based on reliance on cleaner vehicles. And what is classified as a cleaner vehicle as it becomes off the production line and is tested turns out to be not quite the same as what a cleaner vehicle is when it's driven on the streets of London by you or I. We drive considerably more aggressively than the computers which test these vehicles in the production line, and also there's a lot of congestion, and the technology in those cars behaves differently in the real world.
We've had a big switch towards diesel in that 10 or 15 year period. What impact has that had?
I think this is probably the root of the problem. Petrol vehicles in the real world do seem to be behaving in the same way as they're produced. So we've seen very great decreases in emission coming out of petrol vehicles. For one reason or another, this has not happened with diesel vehicles. This, coupled with an increase in the proportion of the fleet which is diesel, has caused this stagnation in air quality, and in some cases a worsening.
Diesel cars have flown off the forecourt, but in protecting the planet, have we ignored a threat on the pavement? The potential killer ingredients from diesel combustion are nitrogen oxides and solid particles, or PMs. Yet the manufacturers claim to have cut them dramatically in actual exhaust. So why are pollution levels so stubbornly high?
3, 4, 5 times. Yes. That's huge change.
It is. It's relatively small volumes of gas, it has to be said.
But nevertheless, as these things are damaging to our health, and there's 3, 4 or 5 times more of them coming out, that's a big deal.
It is. It is absolutely a big deal, and that is the major source of the air pollution problems.
That stark contrast between the nitrogen oxide emission figures that the manufacturers print in their brochures and the real level of filth we have to breathe on the streets of our towns and cities came as a shock to me. But Greg Archer of the Brussels-based campaign group Transport and Environment has been trying to expose those facts for years.
I don't think that policymakers have ignored air pollution. I think they genuinely thought that the system of Euro standards of tightening the amount of pollution which could come out the exhausts of cars would solve the problem. And what we've discovered is the car makers have been really good at producing vehicles that achieve the limits in tests, but which are up to 5 times higher on the road. And the reality of that is that all of that anticipated improvement simply hasn't been delivered. And so all the models that were constructed around how air pollution levels are going to fall in the future haven't been found to be correct. And so now what we've got to do is find new ways of really bringing down those exhaust emissions when the vehicle's being driven on the road. And that's what the focus is now. But again, the car makers are trying to manipulate those new tests to try to prevent that.
The European Automobile Manufacturers Association told us they are deeply committed to delivering on further emissions reductions. But there is still no agreement on how real-world on-road driving emissions should be measured. Perhaps we shouldn't be blaming the manufacturers anyway. It was changes to the UK tax regime that encouraged the boom in diesel cars.
Yeah, we have seen policies, not specifically to encourage diesel, but to encourage more fuel-efficient, low CO2 vehicles. And that has actively encouraged diesel vehicles. That was a mistake. I think we should have taken into account both the air pollution and the CO2 emissions when we set taxation levels for cars. Yeah, the switch to more diesels has certainly contributed to the high number of deaths which are occurring. There's no question about that.
There is another area where diesel isn't as clean as claimed. These are the tiny particles mixed in with the gas, the PMs, small enough to enter the lungs and bloodstream. Nick Molden of Emissions Analytics again.
The diesel particulate filter that is used to capture the solid particles needs emptying. That's done by burning it off. When they were originally introduced, they were meant to work to burn it off on the motorway, out of town. Ideally, it would always be exhausted when you're on the motorway, but if you have a car which you only use for town runaround, you're never going to be on the motorway. So increasingly, the cars will burn it off in town. At that moment, in the 10-15 minutes that this regeneration happens, significantly exhausting of ash, other material, alongside much more CO2 and more NO2 for that period.
So if I'm sitting behind a diesel car that happens to have chosen that moment to flush out its diesel particulates, what's it going to look like? What's it going to be like?
You will probably see a puff of what looks like smoke.
In effect, they're sort of emptying their ashtray as they drive along.
In a way, yes.
You could move closer to nature, say Orkney or the Outer Hebrides, with their best of British offering of 4.2 micrograms of PM 2.5 per cubic metre of air. Or you could plant nature closer to you.
This is using an electron microscope to look at the surface of the leaf. And these are silver birch leaves for an experiment we've done in Lancaster. So this is an amazing picture. This is a close-up of the surface of the leaf. There are hairs sticking out of the leaves. And you can see that in the irregularities of the leaf surface, and particularly around the trichomes, there are these agglomerations of particles. So these are the particulates that are contributing to this health hazard. And you can see there's millions of particles agglomerating in these groups that we can see on the screen here.
Tree leaves have a remarkable ability to intercept pollution particles. Professor Barbara Mayer of Lancaster University has been using them as a low-cost pollution detector for the past few years. Now she wants to go a step further and use the trees to actually cut the pollution in and around our homes.
The story with this is that we used silver birch trees. We put a line of silver birch trees up outside a row of terraced houses in Lancaster in order to see how much PM they could remove from inside those houses. So we found they were fantastic. They took out about 60% of the PM in the indoor environment. So that attracted a bit of attention internationally, and this guy who's an estates manager for one of the communes outside Stockholm, so he emailed me and he said, we like the idea of reducing PM, especially because he's responsible for preschools in this area of Stockholm. And it is the case that many schools and nurseries actually form PM hotspots. And of course the reason for this is because the parents often drive the children to school, pull up outside, often leave the engine running while the children get out, say their goodbyes, and that happens morning and afternoon. And so we're designing some PM protection for the school by choosing specifically some evergreen and some deciduous species to plant up outside the preschool in order that the children inside and outside are exposed to much less PM.
Barbara Mayer's work suggests that we can take some control over our pollution destiny, but really big changes are going to need regulation, policy and laws. So how did the experiment go with our lawmakers turned lab rats? Time to reveal the results from our MPs Mike Kane, Matthew Orford and Joan Wally.
We've got all the results back from the MPs, from the pollution monitors and the GPS, and we've been looking at how the pollution levels that they've been exposed to, what they've been breathing relates to what they've been up to. And something immediately jumps out. These MPs travel a lot in their job, and in almost all cases it's while they're travelling in vehicles they're exposed to the highest pollution levels. What really jumped out of the London data, when all the MPs were travelling together from Oxford Street to City Hall, was that taxi journey caused the highest exposure. So this taxi was travelling in congested traffic, it was a hot day, the windows were probably open, and that caused a lot of pollution to get into the cab.
OK, so I can probably avoid sharing a taxi with an MP on a hot day in central London, but they were wearing monitors back in their constituencies too. What did you learn there?
Mike in Manchester fully embraced the opportunity to carry this monitor around, and he had lots of mixed travel. So, for example, in the morning he travelled into Manchester on the train, and then later that day in the afternoon he travelled back out from central Manchester in a car or a taxi. And you can immediately see that the levels on the train were much, much lower. He also walked around central Manchester, around Manchester Piccadilly, and there was one particular street, Lever Street, where pollution levels as he walked along there were 3 times higher than 5 minutes later when he walked along the canal.
So is there anything the rest of us could take from this experiment, say in changing the way we move around our cities?
Usually in a city we have choices. If we're walking, we can choose which route we walk, and it's common sense. If you think that the pollution is mostly coming from vehicles' exhausts, then try and avoid vehicle exhausts. Walk along back streets, quiet routes. It's usually much quieter and much more pleasant anyway.
There's also certain activities like journeys to school and jogging where you can give quite specific advice and make a big impact. I see people jogging along busy roads, and it's crazy. Jog through a park, jog through a back street. It's much more sensible, much more healthy. It's also what mode of travel. Not only are trains better for the environment in terms of local emissions, while you're in that train, it's almost like being inside your home. Levels are relatively clean in a train because they're not surrounded by lots of other trains producing pollution like you are inside a car.
Good advice from Benjamin Barrett at King's. But Joan Whalley, chair of the Environmental Audit Committee, is determined that it shouldn't just be personal protection tips that come out of the MP's week as pollution guinea pigs. She wants the public to start making a fuss and the government to take action.
In a way, it's very easy to ignore what's happening with air quality because it is an invisible problem. But I think that once you've actually got these reports come back and they stare you smack bang in the face, that really is a wake-up call for action. And I very much hope that the members of the committee who took part in the same survey, that we will all come back with renewed vigour to really see how government, local authorities and everybody concerned is going to really, really tackle the problems that we've got that are causing so many different public health issues.
That was a podcast of Costing the Earth from the BBC.